The third and final chapter that's related to the first lecture is Chapter 6, which is on social psychology. The material from social psychology is fairly general, just as the sociology material preceding this was. So we'll go through, scroll through the information, because none of it is really that difficult to understand, although there are a lot of terms to pick up along the way, and I will guide you through that process starting now. One of the basics of social psychology is the whole idea of self-concept and identity formation. And these are very general ideas. The concept of a self-concept is related to a whole string of terms that start with the word self. In fact, anytime you see the word self in sociology or social psychology, it usually is not a universally defined term. There are a lot of researchers and a lot of theoretical work that refers to how a person thinks about themselves. So there's self-concepts, self-identity, a variety of different ways in which you talk about how a person thinks about themselves. But I don't believe any of them are universally defined. So you have to be kind of aware that this is a bit of a loose term. In terms of defining identities and self-identities, essentially, they generally are identified through the process of typical demographic information, kind of like I was talking about in the previous lecture. In this case, things like age, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, any number of different demographic variables beyond that, which establish characteristics that are commonly identified in your society, right? Which may not be specifically things in all societies, but your society specifically, are the characteristics that are usually identified. So in terms of developing a personal identity, there's something called a self-reference effect, which is really your understanding of yourself in relation to everybody else. So very simply, you compare yourself to all the other people that you meet during the course of your life, and you kind of get an idea of how well you're doing in life or what your personality characteristics and so forth are, really just by comparing yourself to other individuals. And of course, you may have something like an ideal self, which probably most people do. You may compare yourself to other people in the self-reference effect, but you're going to hope to become someone of a particular stature or have particular characteristics. In this case, even with you guys, you are trying to get into medical school. And part of your ideal self is you with a medical degree. And that's just part of ideal self. This hypothetical future you with all the characteristics you wish you had. And that, of course, is part of your self-concept, because you don't just compare yourself to people today. You also think about what your goals in life are and how that possible future self would compare to other people. This is really all, as you might imagine, fairly general. I mean, the degree to which these things actually play out as valuable aspects of variables in social psychology really kind of depends on the situation. Probably they pay off more strongly when you're looking at clinical work. In general social psychology, I'm not so sure how much of this really plays out in a significant sense. There are aspects of this self-referencing business, as you see here, self-esteem, self-efficacy, self-concept, that play out more significantly in a practical sense in a day-to-day manner. And these are these aspects of self that play out in terms of locus of control. Locus of control is a term that was developed in the field of personality psychology, which refers to a person's perception. And make sure that you're aware of this. This is a person's perception of how much their behavior actually affects the world around them. It has nothing to do with the reality of how much they affect the world. It's always related to their perception of how much it affects the world. Now, you'll actually see this if you were a psychology student. Perceptions are always much more important than reality because it's your perceptions that you act upon, not necessarily the reality of what's going on. So in terms of locus of control, locus of control is a continuum. And at two ends of the continuum, on one side you have internal locus of control and the other side external locus of control. An internal locus of control refers to a scenario in which a person feels strongly that their behavior actually influences the world around them. So for example, you might say, I know if I study hard, I can get past the MCAT and into medical school. And that's up to me to be able to put in the time and do the work and learn the material. And that would be very much an internal locus of control. The opposite side of this, an external locus of control, really refers to a scenario in which a person does not believe that what they're doing actually matters. So they'll say something like, I studied, I went through the Princeton review, and then I wound up failing the exam. Nothing I do helps my grade come up. It's the exam. The exam is too hard. So what you're actually seeing is when a person has difficulty doing something or they find that they can't do it, they will start to identify external sources of control over their behavior. Some test or some other thing outside their control that manages them, as opposed to the opposite, where a person says, all of my actions are important and eventually I can overcome my obstacles. And this kind of locus of control business plays out a number of different ways. And one of the ways in which it actually plays out significantly here is the manner in which a person exerts self-control. For a person with a high internal locus of control, they tend to exert more self-control. And self-control is defined very simply. It's defined as the ability to delay gratification. So your ability to hold off on obtaining a reward until a later time. And in fact, usually the scenario in which psychologists evaluate your ability to delay gratification usually comes in a source of experiment where you can pick a small reward and have it now, or you can have a much larger reward if you wait some amount of time. And so what usually gets done is you are balancing a small immediate reward with a larger reward that is essentially degraded by time because you have to wait for it. And the point at which the small immediate reward is chosen 50% of the time versus the larger later delayed reward is also chosen at 50% of the time gives you an opportunity to mathematically equate the two rewards themselves. And that itself is built up into a mathematical system to establish the degree to which a reward influences an individual. Although we're talking about social psychology in this case, a scenario like that kind of tweaked a little bit for the use of non-humans and drug addiction is essentially used the same way to establish the order to which drugs are addictive. So like, you can actually make a quantitative statement that says something along the lines that amphetamine and cocaine are equally addictive and both of them are 100 times more addictive than nicotine. And in a case like that, you actually establish these weights of the rewards in terms of choosing an immediate reward or waiting for something more delayed. So there's really kind of a much broader aspect in this whole story of self-control, but we're really kind of focused in this chapter on the aspects of human self-control in a social psychology scenario. Individuals that have a high degree of self-control, that typically have an internal locus of control, generally stick to plans that they make for their day. They see that their behavior is important, so they make lists, to-do lists, and they hit that list one point at a time and progress through it. And then at the end of the day, they see what they've got done, what they haven't got done, and they evaluate their performance and then move on to the next day to try to become more efficient, get more work done, or at least stick to a schedule that they can actually complete all of these tasks. You don't see that kind of behavior with individuals with an external locus of control because these individuals have essentially already given up. Having that external locus of control, they tend to feel that their behavior doesn't matter. That actually implies that they have repeatedly tried in the past and have essentially given up at this point. And under circumstances like that, you have an individual that no longer tries. So as a result, when bad things happen to a person who has an external locus of control, they tend to just take the problem and not try to manage it or deal with it or plan ahead so they can avoid the same kind of problem happening again in the future. They just kind of take the punishment, as it were. And this process actually has a very clear analog in animal behavior that was evaluated way back in the 1950s called learned helplessness, a process by which if a subject, including a human, if not an animal, is exposed to some sort of punishment repeatedly that they cannot avoid, they will eventually learn to stop trying to avoid the punishment, and therefore, when they have an opportunity to avoid the punishment, they simply won't respond to do so. And that oftentimes is a process that leads to a variety of psychological disorders, mainly anxiety and depression. And depression being actually the more prevalent one of the two. So it is a very common thing currently from the standpoint of clinical psychology that if a person has depression, there very likely is to some degree a long string of failures that have occurred in their life, things that they have focused upon that they feel that they can't control that are very important to them and that they're losing out. And as a result, they stop trying to manage these issues. Problems continue to occur, and then they feel worse and worse and worse until it starts developing into a clinical depression. Now, some of the other aspects of self-concept and identity formation that we talk about in social psychology, and again, these are fairly general topics, are things like the looking glass self. Looking glass self, we've almost essentially covered it, and in fact, this is a good time to point something out about social psychology. Social psychology is a very broad field. Because you're looking at the behavior of a person interacting with another person, but you're not restricting any of the psychological processes that occur. You're allowing for all things that a brain does for one person to interact with all the things that a brain does for another person. You really have the broadest concepts that you can possibly think of. And in scenarios like this, when you start looking at how things are categorized in social psychology, what you really start to find is that there's a lot of overlap between different topics in social psychology. And you're very much seeing that even between social psychology and sociology, because sociologists largely do the same sort of thing. You're looking at all the things that an individual could do and then multiply it times 1 million people that live on an island. The number of possibilities are staggering. And as a result, you're not going to be able to really trace them all or produce categories of behavior that have very clear parameters on them. So one of the things that you see in social psychology is a lot of overlap between one topic and another, and that's simply the nature of how this work gets done, because you're not restricting any of the systems to one or another thing. Like, you're not looking at how memory works with respect to one person to another, or just learning, or a sensory aspect with respect to just one individual. You're looking at all the possible things that a brain can do and all the possible things that a separate brain can do, and now combining them together. And as a result, when you start talking about concepts like this, or constructs specifically, like self-awareness, self-identity, they tend to overlap with each other. And that's very much where you see this looking glass self issue again. It overlaps with things we talked about earlier, because the looking glass self is when a person evaluates their behavior generally in relation to other individuals, because you can't just evaluate yourself without having ever met another individual, right? You wouldn't compare yourself to anybody because there's nobody to compare yourself to. So on the circumstances like this, you're really just evaluating yourself amongst probably your peer group to get an idea of where you think you stand. And that, of course, leads to this concept of social behaviorism, which is another very broad term. Social behaviorism just simply refers to the idea of rewards and punishments being relevant to a person's pattern of behavior. And so the types of punishments and the rewards that they get interacting with other individuals modifies their patterns of behavior, and that changes how they behave over time. That's a fairly straightforward concept, but that's all social behaviorism is really referring to. How your current pattern of behavior today was developed through a history of reward and punishment interacting with other individuals. Now, is that really any different than the next term, socialization? No, socialization is really just a broader term referring to this whole process. And in fact, socialization is a much older term. Social behaviorism is a little bit more specific, more recent term, actually, that would have come up sometime around the 1960s. Term socialization would have probably been around 2,000 years ago. But as a person interacts with the members of society, they get an idea of who they are in relation to everybody else, and that's just part of their identity formation. So all of that is, of course, related to all of the rewards and punishments that that person can experience socially. Now, many of the things that influence identity formation do come from social factors, from a variety of things that psychologists or sociologists generally refer to as agents of socialization. And those are things that typically most people are exposed to, like a family, right? There's an interaction between you and other family members as you grow up. Your family treats you a particular way. You start to evaluate yourself in relation to your other family members and begin to form an identity. Then when you move out to school, you take that identity and you compare yourself to other individuals. You may realize that you actually have some skills that other friends don't have at school, and you may find out also that you have some weaknesses, and that will kind of change what your identity is in that broader sense of being outside your own family. Then there are going to be peer groups, individuals that you will choose to play with as a child, and then as years go by, your workplace as well. How good of a worker are you? What skills do you have relative to other individuals? How aggressive are you in trying to get a promotion? All of these things are things that people compare themselves with other people that are around them all the time. It's natural to compare yourself to other people to get an idea of where you are in relation to other individuals. And certainly these aspects of socialization are going to come through aspects of government and religion. There's a wide range of religions, a wide range of different types of government styles. Some of them may promote things like independent thought and independence or freedom, and other ones are much more paternal in that the government or the religion kind of places you in a position to always be subservient to that religion or that government. And there's any number of different religions or government styles that you could refer to. And of course, it may depend also on your status in society in relation to that government or the religion, whether you've joined the religion or not, or even had a government position. So as you might see, there's a lot of different ways you can play with this idea. It's really kind of limited by your own imagination. And there's a lot of different ways you can actually go. And certainly with mass media and technology, things have changed since the internet has started. The kinds of things that news media has stressed back in, let's say, the 1970s has changed since social media has started, because news agencies have used social media to promote their own programs, their own channel, the stories that they run, the degree to which they stress them, and all of those things kind of get modified. And that in that realm of social media, people start to hear certain types of stories over and over again, in part because they simply bounce around inside of social media. You just kind of boost the story, get people talking about it, and then it bounces around for a while and it just dies out. But there are people specifically who have jobs that manage this kind of stuff, right? Social media influencers, people that literally get hired as full-time jobs to do this kind of work, to keep promoting particular types of stories. If it's not marketing to buy sneakers, it's going to be people that are hired from the New York Times to keep pushing a particular storyline to try to draw people back to the New York Times website, so that people will read a story there, get exposed to the New York Times advertising, which is how the Times is going to wind up making money. Some of the other aspects in terms of identity formation as well come from the mixing of different cultures within any one particular culture. And if you look here, there's kind of an odd categorization system in your book. There's cultural assimilation and assimilation and amalgamation as subpoints to that, and then multiculturalism as a separate topic. But there's actually a simpler way to kind of view these. Assimilation, amalgamation, and multiculturalism are all ways in which different cultures blend together in one society. In assimilation, everybody ultimately becomes part of the major culture. In amalgamation, that happens less so, and in multiculturalism, it happens the least amount. And these, of course, are just theoretical concepts. These are not descriptions of exactly how things happen. There's evidence for assimilation, amalgamation, and multiculturalism in any society, but any society at any one point in time is not finished doing its thing, right? It's always functioning. There's always tomorrow. So at any one point in time, you can find evidence for assimilation, amalgamation, and multiculturalism. But over the course of time, if you always see them, what it really sounds like is ultimately you're going to wind up with primarily assimilation. Because if multiculturalism always existed from the same individuals, then there'd never be any kind of primary culture. You would just have a million separate cultures over time, right? You'd still have Ukrainian culture from the 1890s because an immigrant from Ukraine came to the United States in the 1890s, and multiculturalism would imply that there's going to be a group of individuals that live by Ukrainian 1890s culture somewhere in Boca Raton. That seems unlikely, right? Times are going to change, cultures are going to change, and so people tend to blend with the majority culture ultimately. Subcultures are primarily related to strong, well-defined cultures that are just not part of the major culture, but are aspects of individual groups. They oftentimes are not that large, and they don't always have to occupy the same physical space any longer. So there are things like, internet gamers today that would be a proper subculture. Individuals that are really interested in gaming and they buy the newest laptop or desktop computer so they could always have the fastest connections. They spend money on the best internet service, and they interact with other people that are possibly spread around the globe. But they are really a subculture of individuals that do gaming possibly at the highest levels that gaming can be done, so that they will participate in competitions and maybe even make their career by playing games on large screens. As odd as that sounds, that's actually a thing now. More traditional example of a subculture would have been something like the Hells Angels or the pagan motorcycle gangs back from the 60s. Although I think they're still around, they're nearly completely gone at this point. But there's any number of different types of subcultures like that still exist. And one of the last things on this page, oddly enough, just kind of tacked on there like it doesn't even belong based on everything else we've been talking about, is the development of morality. An old idea from this fellow named Kohlberg came up with a concept that morality develops in three general stages. And this idea, which was, I believe, first proposed back in the 1960s, is not really a gold standard any longer. It still floats around in social psychology textbooks as a general idea of how morality develops over time. But the original model that was developed by Kohlberg is not very specific. But I'll give you the basics to what you would actually see in terms of his three-stage model. From birth up until about age 6, and of course you're not going to get a whole lot out of a 1-year-old in this case, if you address any kind of moral question with a child under age 6, they generally view morality in terms of whether or not a person is punished or rewarded. So if mom says you're not allowed to have cookies before dinner, and then you steal a cookie and she never knows it, then it was okay. For a child under 6, then it was fine. But if you got caught with the cookie and mom yells at you and you were punished, then it was bad. So the morality for a child under age 6 always is dependent upon whether or not you got away with it or you didn't get away with it. So that is how it's established. From about age 6 to about age 12, an individual will follow very strict rules. Whatever is the verbal rule told to them by an adult, that is, stealing is not allowed. Now that you have that rule, that's true 100% of the time in all cases. It's a completely black and white issue. So for a 10-year-old, for example, if you ask them morality questions like, there's a zombie apocalypse, and your family is one of the last families that are alive in your neighborhood, and you're running out of food, but the people next door to you have long since run away, and you can bust the window in their house, go into their garage, and take all the canned goods that they left behind. A 10-year-old would say, no, that's stealing. If they have really had it established in them that stealing is wrong. Even in a scenario where your family's going to starve to death in a zombie apocalypse, the 10-year-old is going to tell you that you can't take the canned goods from the neighbor's house because it's stealing. By the time you get past age 12, you will wind up seeing much more context-specific types of moral reasoning. A child who's 16, for example, will tell you it's not okay to just go rob your neighbor for their canned goods when there's no zombie apocalypse. But if your family's going to die and they're not around any longer because they ran away 6 weeks ago and probably are not coming back, then it makes perfect sense that you should be able to go in their house and take the canned goods so that you and your family don't starve. This kind of context-specific morality is just the way you see adults around the entire globe apply legal systems. All legal systems, whether it's the American judicial system or the Iraqi one or the one in China, it always depends. Whether or not someone committed a crime always depends on the context. So, the rule is you're not allowed to kill anybody, but then if you murder somebody and you go to court, you can always defend yourself and say, well, it was self-defense. And maybe it actually was self-defense. So therefore, you break the rule of you're not allowed to murder anybody in society because there are some contexts under which you can actually kill an individual. And that's just the way adult humans are. In all cases, everything an adult human does is always context specific. And that really plays itself out very much so in terms of morality development. Now, in this scenario, we kind of switch gears here and we start taking a look at attributional aspects of human psychology. Instead of talking about a person's self-identity, you start talking about the way in which somebody can actually have their behavior addressed in terms of whether or not they are angry themselves or angry at somebody else. And if we take a look at the top of the slide here, you kind of see what's sort of like a flow chart. That's this attribution aspect connected down to the image on the bottom right hand part of the slide. If an individual is behaving differently than usual, there are three basic questions that you can ask. Is the behavior consistent, distinctive, or is there a consensus about it? And if we take a look down at the image itself, we can ask whether or not an individual's behavior is distinctive. Distinctive means that it does not normally occur. And if a pattern of behavior is unique at that current time, then it's probably related to some external event and not an internal event or an internal personality characteristic. If the distinctiveness is low, so that it's a pattern of behavior that frequently occurs, then it's probably more so along the lines of a personality characteristic, and it would be a characteristic you would expect to see very frequently for that individual. In terms of consensus, that refers to whether or not an individual is, for example, angry at a whole bunch of people, or if consensus is low, that they're only angry at you. If they're angry at everybody, then there's probably more likely an external cause for it. But if they're angry at you, that is, there's a low consensus, then there's more likely an aspect where there's a personality characteristic involved. And in terms of consistency, if the consistency is very high, that the person behaves this way all the time, then it's very likely related to something like a personality characteristic. And if it's very low, if it's an odd event, then it's probably related to some particular external event that had occurred. These attributional aspects play themselves out in a variety of different ways. And in fact, social psychology has a wide range of them. There are a few here that we'll take a look at on the next slide, but they tend to fall into these categories that you see here on the bottom of the slide: the fundamental attribution error, the self-serving bias, and the just world phenomenon. And these are all largely explained on the next slide, but what essentially these are going to be are scenarios that allow you to predict whether or not a person will either perceive that something is caused by themselves or by somebody else. Usually, in most cases, you'll be looking at scenarios in which something bad has happened. Now, whatever bad thing has happened is, of course, just perceptual to the individual themselves. But the fundamental attribution error will generally refer to a scenario in which an individual is going to attribute any bad event happening to another person as being a result of themselves, right? That person, the bad thing that happens to the person is because of them. But whenever something good happens, that it was probably more so luck for that individual. In terms of the self-serving bias, what you see is an individual directs the attention toward themselves and not another individual. And when something bad happens to themselves, they tend to blame external reasons for it, like it was outside my control. But if something good happens to them, then they tend to accept responsibility for it and say, I'm so great, I made that happen. And then the just world phenomenon, back to a scenario where something bad happens, because you don't apply the just world phenomenon ever to a good event. If, for example, you see a street person living under the highway, what the just world phenomenon generally would predict is that most people would see the homeless person living under the highway as being responsible for their own problems, right? And so they'll say, why doesn't that person just go get a job? How come they don't flag down a cop and get taken to a social service agency where they'll be set up with Section 8 housing and Social Security check or something else like that? All they got to do is just identify themselves as being homeless and in need of help, and society will help them because there is a social service net to stop people from living on the street. And if the person's there, everybody will just essentially blame. The person's there because they're not smart enough. They're too lazy. It's their own fault for being there, and that's what they'll wind up focusing on. A range of these characteristics play themselves out on this chart, and these are fairly easily understood. We can address them more in class if you like. I don't see in this lecture that it's actually really worth talking about each of these when you can just go ahead and read them. So I would suggest pausing the video, taking a look at this chart, and getting a feel for how these play themselves out. And we can address this chart more in class if you like. In a very broad sense, in terms of culture, culture is going to affect the way in which people attribute blame to other individuals. In Western society, there's more tendency or focus on internal actions or internal intentions. And in Eastern societies, it's oftentimes focused on external ones. A nice example of this comes from the 2008 worldwide economic failure as a result of the housing crisis. In the West, in most places, there were lots of discussions about finding the people responsible for the economic downturn and putting them in jail. In Eastern countries, there was less concern about jailing individuals who were responsible and more concern about changing the laws that allowed these things to happen. And these are just simply two different ways in which to view how things happen. Certainly, there may have been people in Japan or China who were certainly explicitly responsible for selling bad services, mortgages, and so forth to other individuals and knew exactly what they were doing. But their government may have primarily focused on changing the laws. Whereas here, people were focused on, talking about putting people in jail, although almost nobody did go to jail. It's not like anyone ignored the external factors of the laws and regulations that allowed this kind of thing to happen, and therefore many of the laws and regulations changed afterward anyway. So it's not like in either culture you won't address personal responsibility or the external aspects like laws, but there's a tendency to talk about or focus on socially one aspect as opposed to another. In terms of self-perceptions of other individuals, there are things like false consensus and projection bias that oftentimes come from the groups that you're involved in and the people that you speak to on a regular basis. False consensus refers to scenarios in which a person typically only talks to other individuals that are similar to themselves. And of course, that just makes sense, right? You become friends with people that are similar to yourself. That's very standard basic psychology. But now that your peer group essentially is a bunch of people that are very similar to you, there's a higher probability that you and all your friends will have the same types of beliefs about certain things, like who you should vote for president, or how the government should be run, or why is healthcare so expensive, or is going to medical school really important. And you're going to hear kind of the same types of answers to these questions all the time, and you'll come to believe that everybody must have these same types of opinions. That's what false consensus is. It's your belief that everybody essentially thinks like you, largely because everybody you talk to thinks like you. But that's actually a bias that comes from the fact that your perception about how people think was derived from a group of people that you hand selected as friends and think very similar to you. Projection bias largely looks the same way when you take those ideas and project them off to other individuals. So based upon a limited experience of individuals that you talk to, you wind up projecting your own ideas onto other individuals to largely as a result of your limited experience with other people's opinions. So false consensus and projection bias are actually very similar to each other. Other parts of this that blend with this whole story of kind of an in-group and an out-group story leads to the story of stereotypes and prejudice, which always tend to go together, of course. Prejudice is a term that refers to a prejudgment, and that implies that there is something called informational bias, that you're told something ahead of time about a person or an event or a product, for example, in terms of a product review, and you develop a belief system about it without ever having experienced it. And this is, of course, as you might imagine, what a lot of people in marketing do on Amazon.com, where literally a company hires people in marketing to make phony accounts and to buy a product and then to write a good review about it, just so that those reviews are on Amazon, so that when you come along and you're thinking, gee, I need to buy a headphone set for my laptop, you see nothing but good reviews of that topic. And that's essentially, the kind of thing you're looking at. Of course, in a more traditional sense, stereotypes might be applied toward people, usually on typical demographic basis. But it's no different than the manipulation of reviews that I just mentioned, because you are biasing somebody's opinion before they ever get the product, or in a more traditional case, biasing a person's view of someone before they ever meet that individual. So in the bottom right hand portion of the screen, you see a graph here which is kind of a description of an aspect of prejudice. If you're told ahead of time, let's say before you move to Florida, that there's so many old people down in Florida and they'd like to double park outside a drugstore. So, grandma's going to take 10 minutes to get out of the damn car so she can go in there and use a coupon to buy something or get her medication. And her husband just blocks traffic, double parking in the parking lot. And this is what you're told even before you've ever moved here. If you ever see an old person double parking outside of a drugstore, that will immediately be recognized by you as something you had been told. You will notice it immediately. And when you see young people park in a regular parking spot, you'll say, well, of course, young people don't double park. They can walk the 15 feet into the store. So you develop this bias where even though you may see old people double park or old people use a regular parking spot, you may sometimes see young people use a regular parking spot or sometimes actually double park. You will tend in your memory only to focus on the times in which what you're experiencing matches with the information you were fed beforehand. And so in your memory, only the biased story will actually become prevalent in what you think about. And that becomes the basis by which you establish a stereotype or a prejudice for an individual. First, it's that initial information that you're given. And then after that, there's a bias in focusing only on the events that you see that support that idea as opposed to negate it. These ideas also play themselves out in a variety of ways in terms of scapegoating and illusory correlations as well. Illusory correlations really are just what I talked about in terms of the double parking issue. Scapegoating also occurs in terms of the same basic process, because if you're given information that somebody's to blame for a problem, so disregarding who's in the White House, if you're told the Republicans are to blame for the economy being bad, and you hear this over and over and over again, you may tend to notice anytime a Republican governor or senator or a Republican president is responsible for some sort of economic problem. But you'll always ignore somebody from the Democrat Party who actually may be just as responsible in a separate way. And of course, the reverse would happen as well. So it's a process of prejudice that comes from information before you meet the individual or the experience itself, and then a process by which you keep rehashing the same idea and supporting it by focusing in your attention only the things that support what you were originally told. One aspect here that I didn't mention, which is slightly off from what we've been talking about, are the ABCs of attitudes. This, as you'll see a little bit more in the book, ABCs of attitudes is a person's attitude about something, their belief system about something, comes from their affect, behavior, and cognition. That is their emotions, their behavior, and the way they think. That's the ABCs of attitudes: affect, behavior, and cognition. And those are the kind of the three main parts of aspects that influence how an attitude is formed. So aspects of stereotypes and prejudgments and so forth can be modified by any one of those three attributes. And in fact, a way to play this out in a somewhat interesting way is to take a look at this movie we're going to see here that's related to self-fulfilling prophecy. So rather than kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy about another person, this is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy about yourself based upon your relationship to other individuals that you choose to participate in social behavior with.
Suspecting member of the
In this segment, we meet students from a school in England who have modified their required school uniforms to create subgroup identities with small, distinctive features.
George Abbott School in Guildford, Surrey, has nearly 2,000 pupils who all live within 10 miles of here and are from mostly similar backgrounds. Like all school children, they're divided into groups for lessons, but come break time, they divide themselves.
If you just look across the playground, you'll see that everyone pretty much looks the same. They're all wearing the same uniform, they're the same age, they all have the same accents, they're all the same colour. There's nothing much to distinguish them. So one of the things that's really important to them is to make some differences, to give themselves a sense of being distinctive. And the way they do that is to join different groups and to mark out very important but small differences between each of the groups.
We've been named as the Indie Girls, the four of us. We all wear the same stuff, we're into the same music. There's another group of girls, another large group of girls who are very well recognised, very well known, called the Tracys or the Tarts.
People call us like the Tarts girls, but I don't know, it's because we don't, I don't know, we like to make them like to look after.
We're not subtle, are we?
If you wear socks, you have to
roll them down.
Right.
And your skirt's got to be like skin coloured tights, whatever. Skin coloured tights, so you look
shirt in at the front, out the back.
And then it comes out a little bit at the back. No jumpers unless you're absolutely freezing. Otherwise, because that's what the indie chicks do.
Group of boys in the corner, which we call the grungers, all wear baggy clothes and reputation for being dirty.
The grungers are more like into snowboarding and skateboarding and stuff, like extreme sports, and so kind of more cutting edge.
Up in the cages, where they play football, is another group of boys called the Garys, who are like the opposite to the grungers.
All the Garys hang out here and they hang out down there. This is sort of like our place and that's theirs.
The grungers won't go anywhere near the Garys because it makes them look as if they like football and they like to wear like gold chains and all that lot. And it's the same way around, the Garys wouldn't want to be near the grungers because it makes them look as if they smell.
We don't smell.
What's this? Much.
13 is a really important age when children are really beginning to figure out who they're going to be as adults. They're figuring out, what should I wear? What should I listen to? What should I be interested in? How should I behave? They're moving from that comfortable time of childhood when they could just do what all the children do to now a kind of transitional period, and there's a lot of uncertainty around for them.
There's even more uncertainty if you're someone like Anna, who's what the rest of the playground call a loner, someone who's not part of a group.
I'm independent and everything, but I do sometimes feel that it would be nice to be in a group, to have somebody else always there to protect you, to stand up for you. I get names called at me, but it doesn't really bother me that much, because if they feel that they have to pick on me because I'm not like them, then it's their own problem.
Anna's proud of her independence and ability to mix, but without realising it, even she's part of a group of loners.
Sometimes these groups are real groups, like these ones out here, like the grungers, for example, and they all sit together and they do everything together. Other times they can be groups that are more kind of in our heads. So some of the people out here, for example, might be treated as loners or counted as loners, but you'll find that they themselves have connections that give them that sense of security, the sense that they know what they're doing the right kind of thing.
The loners have bonded just like the grungers, the Garys, the Indies and the Tarts, and they display all the hallmarks of group mentality, like loyalty and competition. Anna even says it herself.
They're really nice people and everything, and they've got such nice personalities, it can actually be better than some of the people in groups.
So instinctive and subconscious is this need to belong that we're loyal to groups without realising it, and they change our behaviour in powerful ways.
So that's a nice example of a self-fulfilling prophecy, given that an individual joins a group, the group has a characteristic that it develops based around the ideas that bounce around in that group. It just becomes more solidified, probably more extreme over time, and then the individuals feel they have to hold on to that idea to maintain their group identity. That is essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, one of the other things that we could talk about here that's related to these aspects is social facilitation. Social facilitation is a story related to how large groups affect people. Now, certainly all throughout the 20th century, and I'm sure backwards in time as well, it was obviously clear that large groups affect how people behave. Probably the most obvious thing being that a lot of people don't like to do public speaking. You know, you could talk to another individual, but if there are 30 people staring at you, some people freeze up really pretty significantly. So in this case, during the 20th century, starting back around the 1950s, people started to study the manner in which large groups affect people. And there tends to be three general things that occur. One, a large group can make you perform better regardless of whatever it is you're doing. Two, a large group presence can make you actually perform worse. So the opposite. And then three, one kind of orthogonally related aspect is that a large group can make it so that you become lazy. Now, there's an odd thing about this. If a large group is a large group, how could a large group have three completely different effects here? There has to be something missing from the story, and of course there is. Performance is increased as a result of a large group, mainly because a person has a really well-trained skill. So for example, like a professional athlete, somebody that practices a whole lot, if a large group is cheering for that individual, that high degree of skill will be enhanced by the additional adrenaline and excitement that they experience, largely because their skill set is really well enhanced. However, in the second case, if the skill set is not well developed, in this case, for example, like a person who has to give a public speech in front of their classroom, right? Almost nobody speaks publicly, right? There's few of us that do that kind of work on a regular basis. So if you're a student in a class and there's 30 people in there, and you might have a bunch of friends that you talk to at any one time, but you don't give a specific exacting speech to 30 people, that's not a well-trained skill, and so that large group winds up degrading your performance. And the last scenario, the social loafing, which is kind of an unfortunate name that social psychologists picked to identify this. Social loafing is essentially you not doing anything. You, specifically in this case, as a result of a large group, do less work. Where would you see that? Well, try to imagine you work in a cubicle farm, right? Now, something like a large room filled with cubicles that where everybody has their workspace, and maybe you work for Liberty Mutual Insurance Company, and all day long you process insurance claims. Now, if you get tired of staring at the computer screen and filling out government forms and filling out forms that you know are just going to be denied claims that are going to go back and forth, and you feel like your life's not going anywhere because you're just pushing paper to be able to make some money, you may occasionally, given the number of people in the room, pick up some files and simply go take a walk. You may go to another floor of the building. You may just walk around. And if anybody ever stops you, given that there's so many people and you can't manage them all, you could just say, well, I'm looking for Johnson. I'm looking for Johnson. I have the file and I have some questions for him. And so, you kind of cover yourself. But really what you're doing is absolutely nothing. And the reason is there's so many people that everybody can't be managed easily, and as a result, you can goof off more easily. You have something like that play out in the very bottom of the screen here in de-individuation, oftentimes like during rioting mobs. Now, it's not laziness in this case, social loafing, that plays out in a rioting mob, but in a rioting mob, traditionally, the police have not been able to identify specific individuals for busting a window or setting a cop car on fire and so forth. And typically, what you wind up seeing is that people become emboldened by their anonymity. Just as people are emboldened by their anonymity on social media, right? So somebody could give do a YouTube video for 5 minutes about petunias and roses, and then you're just going to get some troll who comes into the comments section and starts cursing at them. It's completely pointless, but nobody knows who the troll is. They hide by their anonymity, and that's essentially what happens in a rioting mob traditionally. And so having recognized that, certainly by the role of social psychologists, back by, I believe, the late 1970s, it became common for police departments to roll up on rioting mobs with cameras and to let everybody see that they were being video recorded. And then the police give some clips of that riot to the local news station, who was more than willing to play portions of a riot, and then I'll identify some poor schlub who just randomly gets picked out that busts a window or something, and then on Channel 6 Action News they'll say, if anybody knows who this guy was that busted the window of the jewelry store, turn him into the police. And people do. And it's one way to kind of push back on a rioting mob in a sense. And with the more recent mobs that happened after George Floyd's death, you see many more people covering their face. And that's because rioters, especially career rioters or rioters that are organized, that are intending to go and smash and grab and destroy property, are bringing masks with them, not masks because of COVID, but otherwise just face coverings so that the police can't recognize who's actually doing the rioting. It's a thing that you should be aware of now at this point in time. When a riot occurs and some people just so happen to have face masks or full face coverings, that is essentially an indication that that person has planned out participating in a riot and has brought away to cover themselves up, to protect themselves from being identified as an agitator. It's a thing that you should be aware of now, but it comes directly out of social psychology. Now let's take a look at a second movie here. This one in terms of helping, because all of this aspect of groups and the effect of a group on an individual affects whether or not individuals will help somebody who's in need, whether there's a small group or a large group. And in particular, as you probably are aware, there is a negative correlation between group size and the likelihood of helping. So that if there's a lot of people around, it's much less likely to get help.
Suspecting member of the Liverpool Street Station in London. A drunk lies on the pavement. In fact, he's our actor Peter, but these passers-by aren't to know that. And since he looks the worse for wear, not critically ill, they ignore him. Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow. This time, we've dressed Peter as a respectable city gent. How long before he's rescued now that he looks the part?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm all right, thanks.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir. And suddenly, everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
Why you're lying on the floor in the rain?
After a couple of minutes, even the police turn up.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping and walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay.
I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because he's going to ruin his suit anyway.
Our actress Ruth takes Peter's place. She's not a drunk, but she's also not a city gent. How long before she gets help? Minutes have passed, and 34 people have passed.
People don't really want to know. They just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
But it's more complicated than that. If the street were deserted, a passerby would probably go to the rescue. But these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't help. Like the woman who faced impossible questions in the service station, they're afraid to stand out from the crowd. So like the people in our smoke experiment, they won't take action if nobody else does, even against their own better judgment. This woman, for instance, has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing.
You all right? You all right?
Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You all right, you sure?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
She don't look well, does she?
You all right, yeah? Yes, you are.
First I thought she was dead. Then I sort of checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her, because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
Whatever we do that other people notice has a ripple effect, for better or for worse.
Peter's now having the same problem. This time, we've swapped his suit for casual clothes. He's not drunk, and we've asked him to act like he's in pain.
Help! Help! Help me! Please, somebody! Help me! Help me, somebody! Please help me! Help me! Help me! Help me! Please, somebody help me! Please, somebody help me!
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is two conflicting rules. One is the rule that we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help. And it's very difficult to rebel.
As as we move on with this story of social psychology, we move into the whole aspect of group polarization, which is just more of the same material we've already been talking about, but is just blended over into slightly different terms. Group polarization we already saw in the conformity video with the school-age kids. What did they do? Well, they formed groups of friends. Then the friends start to take on a characteristic. Then they start to promote that particular characteristic. That's the polarization aspect as they become more and more extreme in their views. So, in a simple example, if you had the Young Democrats Club on campus and everybody joined up, what you would wind up seeing is that their view of the ideas from the Democrat Party would become more and more enhanced over time. In fact, may actually become rather extreme or polarized. You see the same sort of thing in groups like ISIS or any kind of terrorist organization. In fact, groups that are extreme, like terrorist organizations, absolutely go through the process of group polarization. They always attempt to become more religious or more extreme in whatever their viewpoint is, and always wind up seeing other groups as enemies or outsiders to themselves. So a lot of this polarization comes from information. That's informational social influence. That's the formal name for what I had originally told you about with respect to prejudice. When you get information ahead of time but not actually engage with the object or the person or the event itself, that is informational social influence. When you are engaging with it, then it's normative social influence. The term normative always refers to conformity that occurs when you're interacting with another person or an object. Let's just stick with people in this case. So norms or normative behavior means that you go to a group and then you behave like everybody else because you see what they're doing and you just copy it. Monkey see, monkey do. That's normative behavior. Informational behavior is before you go in and meet that group, somebody tells you what they're like. And that biases your opinion when you go in. And then so if anybody does things that you were told they're going to wind up doing, it stands out in your memory and starts to enhance, very possibly, an illusory correlational effect. This whole process of group polarization tends to lead to what is oftentimes called groupthink or mind guarding, which are essentially the same thing. The group that, let's say, is the Young Democrat group on campus may have difficulty understanding why anybody would want to follow socialist ideals or Republican ideals for that matter, because everything seems so well put together and rational because everyone they speak to is from the Young Democrats Club. And because every problem is solved based on the way that they think, they can't understand how anybody else could have a different thought. And that's essentially what groupthink is. And groupthink itself, because it's so extreme, tends to be protected because it doesn't seem like other people actually have the correct answer. So you just keep protecting your own views. And that's when you start to see some irrational patterns of behavior where people ignore facts and just focus on the kinds of things that they've already decided is correct. Now, when you look at these things, they are great for you judging other individuals. In fact, it leads you to be very judgmental toward other people as well. And I mean this as you, as a researcher, when you identify some group has extreme thoughts and therefore they have groupthink and they're ignoring all the facts, that's mind guarding. At what point do you actually say they're just reapplying what they know. You could think of these aspects of thinking as, in a scientific sense, applying like a hypothesis or a theory. At what point does a theory completely break down, right? If no theory since the beginning of science in 1600 has been completely and absolutely correct. So if anybody continues to apply any theory, that means there's some aspect of groupthink or mind guarding that's going on. And that sounds awfully judgmental, right? It starts sounding like you've placed yourself in a position where you know best for all other individuals. So it's actually somewhat ironic that when you identify these processes, it sometimes places an individual in a position where they actually start to do it as they identify other individuals as having this characteristic. It's an odd aspect of social behavior in which a person has to be very careful about how they speak and how they think about other groups. Make sure that because they don't believe your opinions, that they're not doing mind guarding, but maybe they actually have a rational belief system that simply has not been completely wiped out through a rational argument. Some of these other aspects as well that kind of cling to this story refer to stigma, deviance, aspects of identifying an individual as a felon. When an individual is identified as being a criminal of some sort, that's a thing that certainly might follow them for a long period of time. However, felons come in all sorts. Sometimes people are felons because they are placed in prison because they violated a bad law. And in fact, they may be in prison because they purposely violated the bad law so they could go to court and then they could have their day to try to address the injustice itself. Essentially, what's being identified here is that labels for individuals sometimes have very negative influences. And this may not be such a big surprise, but it is clearly a part of social psychology. And so it's something that you need to be aware of. One way to kind of play this out in terms of most of the aspects that we have been talking about come from the story of conformity and obedience. And in this video, you're going to see a nice, somewhat comical aspect of conformity and obedience play itself out.
Respecting member of the
I'm sure most of us would hope to take appropriate heroic action when in an emergency situation. But there is another natural tendency that can make this even more difficult: blind obedience to authority.
Would you obey this man? He's Charlie, our actor, dressed to look like he's in charge, though he's in charge of nothing except a bogus uniform. We've brought him to Edmonton in North London, to the shopping centre, to find out exactly how obedient people are.
Excuse me, madam, sorry, could I just stop you? You're about to pass between me and the red bench. Could I just ask you to go the other side? Thanks. That's great. Oh, and just be on the apple, it'd be great. Oh, oh. Thanks very much, madam. These slabs, I couldn't just ask you to knock it down for me. You're probably heavier than I am. Can you give it a good old jump? Yeah, actually, let me just move that way. Can you just jump, please? Yeah, no, two-footed probably, best. I couldn't just ask you to litter, could I? To what, sorry? To litter. To litter? Yeah, have you got anything you could possibly quickly litter? Do you use that? It's probably all right. Okay. Yeah, could you just litter for me, please, sir? Just twice would be great. Kick it away, otherwise it won't. That's it. Give it a kick. Couldn't ask you just to pop that in your other hand, could I? Thanks, that's excellent. Could I ask you to lead with your left? Yes? And just slowly, really, basically.
It's a simple experiment, but amazingly, it works. Out of uniform, though, it's a different story.
Oh, sir, could I just ask you to switch bags with your hands? Just... You couldn't just go and just touch that brick? No?
But with the uniform, 70% of people follow Charlie's bizarre instructions to the letter.
Oh, fine. Give it one more, actually. The wind's a bit weak. That's it. You've got my dental records here. That's proof enough that this is quality sweet corn. Bit harder, please, sir.
He's in uniform.
Stop the bag.
So they obey. We asked Charlie to help us make a wedding video with a difference. The happy couple are actors. Charlie's their registrar. All we need now is a witness, and here she comes. An unsuspecting member of the public fetched off the street.
Could I have your full name, please?
Yeah, Margaret Richardson.
Margaret's offered to bail out the bride and groom, who've supposedly been let down by their friend. What she doesn't know is that Charlie's going to make a mistake. Quite a bad one.
It is my duty to remind you of the solemn and binding character of the ceremony of marriage. Now, could I ask you, please, to repeat after me? I do solemnly declare...
I do solemnly declare...
that I know not...
that I know not...
of any lawful impediment...
of any lawful impediment...
why I...
Margaret Richardson.
Margaret Richardson.
Yes.
Repeat the name, please.
Margaret Richardson.
May not be joined...
may not be joined...
in matrimony...
in matrimony...
to Peter Roy Edmonds...
to Peter Roy Edmonds. Probably initially I thought something was wrong when I started to actually say the vows. And then I really realised something was wrong when I began to place the ring on the finger.
Place the ring on his finger.
I suppose I was just standing there and everybody seemed to be in agreement with what was happening. And I was just told to do it. And for some reason I just did.
Perfect.
So did Eric Taylor.
And could you repeat after me? I call upon these persons here present...
I call upon these persons here present...
to witness that I...
to witness that I...
Eric Taylor...
Eric Taylor...
do take thee...
do take thee...
Julianne Gillett...
Julianne Gillett...
to be my lawful wedded wife...
to be my lawful wedded wife. He was putting the words into my mouth, you know? He was saying that I was to say this and I was to say that, and I was thinking that I'm the witness and the groom ain't saying nothing.
Do take thee...
Sorry?
Do take thee...
Do take thee...
Peter Roy Edmonds...
Peter Roy Edmonds...
to be my lawful wedded husband.
At one point, Margaret protests.
Sorry, I'm confused.
But Charlie's authority is irresistible.
Just repeat the phrase.
But I'm not getting married.
No, just repeat the phrase.
To be my lawful wedded husband. When I looked confused, the response was that I was confused and not the situation.
I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride.
I was just aware that this man was telling me to do this in a very sort of definite way. And there didn't seem to be an option. I'm not quite sure why.
Julianne Gillett and Eric Taylor, you have both made the declarations prescribed by law and have made a solemn and binding contract with each other in the presence of the witnesses here assembled. I now pronounce you man and wife.
When he said that we are actually married, I was scared. I was heading out the door.
Congratulations, sir. Congratulations. May kiss the bride.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
All right, is that me?
Thank you. Yes, you're now married. Well done. Mr. and Mrs. Taylor.
Yeah. You two are married, are you?
Oh.
I'm the witness.
Ah.
I thought there's something wrong here.
Ah, you did put the ring on the...
Yeah, but I thought I'm the witness.
Oh. Ah, I have married you together. Is this going to be a problem?
Oh, yeah.
Well, why do they go along with it? It isn't as though he's wearing a uniform this time. But here we have a situation which we're familiar with. It's the registry office, the flowers, the table, and so on. And in that situation, we're used to people feeding us our lines. They realise something is wrong, but he reassures them. He reduces their uncertainty. And it's like when we're children. Adults give us rules, and that helps us to reduce our uncertainty as kids.
How far could someone in authority get you to do things that don't seem quite right? What about more serious things that go against your conscience and moral values? Nowhere in our education do we get training in how to differentiate just authority deserving our respect from unjust authority that merits rebellion. So we just usually do as we are told.
Okay, so a nice example of conformity in this particular case. You can see how it can apply to a wide range of cases. And in fact, it's probably even useful for you to try to imagine other applications of where this would occur. Certainly, it's easy or useful to think about this kind of thing in terms of everyday relationships. Some of the other things that we also talk about here, which are fairly general, so we'll get through them rather quickly. Aspects of social structures, statuses and roles for individuals, status and master status, roles, role conflict, role strain, and role exit are really, again, fairly general terms, not built up much into a theoretical unit or usable model in this case. The book is really just throwing terms at us in this case and not really doing a whole lot with them. But really all that's being discussed in this case is that every individual will have multiple roles that they play in society. Some cases their status or their role conflicts with other components of roles. So you can be a father, but you're also somewhat of a friend to your children. And as father, you may have to punish your child, but then you're concerned how that's going to undermine your relationship with your child and whether or not they're going to want to go bike riding with you next weekend after having grounded your son for 3 days. These are the kinds of things that are actually being referred to. The conflict is, as I've just described, the role strain is essentially the same sort of thing, except you're talking about the aspect in which the role is running up and encountering problems with another role as well. And then, of course, there's times during which you exit a particular role, like if you were the head or the director of an organization and you had to be everybody's boss, so you always would tell them what to do, but on your role exit and you leave and you're no longer the director, a year later you may come across one of the people that you used to supervise, that you used to give a hard time to, and you may just try to be friendly with them, although they may not be willing to be friends with you after years of you giving them a hard time. But the entire process of your roles are going to wind up changing. Networks and organizations, again, fairly general here. You're talking about social networks and the degree to which people influence each other throughout society. The concept of 6 degrees of separation is an old one that I believe goes back at least to the 1980s. I'm pretty sure it actually goes back to the 1950s originally as a theoretical concept. It was empirically tested in the 1960s by sending postal mail, almost like a chain letter. So there were a few experiments in which psychologists would send postal letters in the 1960s to individuals and ask them to try to find another person that they could pass the letter to, because there was a target individual that they were going to try to get to. And all of this, of course, sounds really sketchy, as you might imagine. So it didn't work out as well from that theoretical standpoint. The 6 degrees of separation is probably more a mathematical thing than a real issue, but there is a considerably closer degree of separation between individuals and society than they may be aware of. If you yourself just tried to count the number of people between yourself and potentially the President of the United States, You may find, at least you may not be able to complete the entire process, but you may get fairly close within a few degrees of separation. Not that you're necessarily going to be able to activate that network either, though. Organizations and their influence on social interactions, certainly fairly straightforward information. Large organizations tend to be very impersonal. There's a lot of business speak. You don't just tell your employees to do things. You talk around topics and talk about success in the future and so forth, but then you ask everybody to stay late without extra pay. It's kind of ridiculous. I think we're all aware of these types of things occurring in modern society, and that certainly does wind up influencing how people view each other and the number of people that they can interact with. Many of the social interactions we have in society are affected by a wide range of things. The way in which you express or detect your emotions, which gender you are, and the likelihood that you are going to influence the manner in which you express or detect emotions. Certainly culture is going to wind up affecting it. In fact, a lot of these things I almost feel kind of silly even talking about, because they're so very straightforward. Just to get through some of these terms, front stage versus backstage self simply refers to a front stage self is you when you're at work. That is your work face, when you're polite and you are fair. And then when you go home, you have your backstage self, where you curse everybody out when they're not around. All the employees and your coworkers that you don't like, and you say what you really think about them to your spouse or your best friends who are not connected to your employees at all, so it's not going to get back there. Now, another aspect of this, somewhat more useful, I think, in many cases in terms of you going to medical school, is the whole story of the elaboration likelihood model. Issues regarding how to form an argument to influence other person's behavior. There are three primary aspects in the elaboration likelihood model: message characteristics, source characteristics, and target characteristics. Message characteristics simply refer to the degree of logic and the size of an argument. So if it's rational and easily remembered, that's much better. If the logic is not there, and if it's maybe too long, like you have 23 main points in your argument, that's going to make it difficult for people to follow. Source characteristics refer to who's speaking the argument. So you as a medical doctor may be telling your patients to stop smoking and to start exercising mildly on a regular basis. If you're a medical doctor who is overweight and smokes, while you tell your patient that they need to start exercising and stop smoking, then that's certainly going to run a counter to your ability to convince anybody of anything. And certainly the target characteristics refer to who you're actually speaking to. Generally, if an individual is much more similar to you, or at least perceptually that person perceives himself similar to you, you'll have an easier time of conveying the information in the argument. Now, when you make arguments to try to adjust a person's behavior, there are two things that oftentimes are focused on: the central and the peripheral roots. Central root really refers to the argument being made primarily based upon the message characteristics. If the argument you make is rational, it has a clear number of points that a person can remember, and it makes its point very clearly, and that affects a person, that's referred to as the central root. If the peripheral root is the thing that makes the argument take hold, that might just be because something like the individual was attractive. The argument wasn't really that important, but you like the argument because the person who made it was attractive. So, if you have two people running for president and one is ugly and smart and the other one's really attractive and dumb, and you think it would be great to have 4 years of a really attractive president who's dumb, that way we can have the amusement of laughing at this person the entire time, then that would clearly be a peripheral root issue. And some of the last things that we talk about here in social cognition and intelligence, social cognitive theory is an aspect of psychology that plays off the interaction between the person and their environment. And everything does that, frankly. This material is very general in your book. Is there anything in the field of psychology in which there is not some sort of interaction between a person and their environment? No, there's not. Social cognitive theory deals with that. Well, so does every single theory in psychology. What's special about the social cognitive theory? Nothing. It's the one that was placed in your Princeton review book. That's about it. So know that social cognitive theory is just related to the interaction between people and their environment. Done. Behavioral genetics and intelligence. This is an aspect of something you probably have come across in biology classes in the past when you talk about the genetic role for particular diseases. And I'm just saying disease as a target process. But in about 1980, specific studies started that were evaluating the genetic role in psychological traits. And from the 1980s until now, every single psychological trait that has been investigated has shown to have both a genetic and an environmental component. Okay, and this is very important, so I'm going to repeat it. So apart from the social cognitive theory, which I just blew right past, right next to that is this extremely important point on the same slide. Since 1980, which is the beginning of the time that psychologists have been able to evaluate the difference between environmental and genetic control of behavior, every single pattern of behavior that has been investigated since 1980 has showed it to have both a genetic and a behavioral component. And that is a very important thing to be aware of in modern psychology, because there's no pattern of behavior, right, that is related to psychology that is either all genetic or all environmental. The degree to which a pattern of behavior is managed by genes or the environment tends to be the primary question that people ask today. So if you say 100% of the control of a pattern of behavior, let's say like your math ability, okay? Your math ability, 100% of your ability to do math comes partly from genetics and partly from the environment. The big question is, what percentage of it is controlled by genetics and what percentage is it controlled by the environment? If 20% is controlled by genetics, then therefore 80% has to be controlled by the environment. If 60% is controlled by the environment, then therefore 40% has to be controlled by genes. And that's a kind of a simplified way in which this process has kind of played itself out. And the way to evaluate the degree to which genes or the environment influence patterns of behavior, you tend to use twin and adoption studies, largely because straightforward, simple experiments in the standard basic experimental form simply cannot be completed for two reasons. One, the technology is not there to assign people characteristics genetically. And secondly, even if you could, you wouldn't be allowed to do it because of ethics. So straightforward randomized studies of gene-environment interactions are never done in basic experimental designs like randomized studies. You have to fall back on correlational studies that are shown as they are here. You, as a researcher, go out into society and you find groups of individuals with different degrees of genetic and environmental similarity. Identical twins that are raised together are raised apart. Fraternal twins that are raised together are raised apart. Siblings that are raised together are raised apart. And adoptees that are raised together, or adoptees that are raised apart, which is essentially unrelated people living apart. Okay? When you take a look at the R value, that is the Pearson correlation coefficient that you've been looking at for the past 4 years in all of your science classes, you'll notice that the individuals that have the most similar genes have the highest correlation coefficient for whatever you're actually measuring. And in fact, there's a smaller bump in similarity when these individuals are raised together in the same household as opposed to being raised apart. So when you take a look at identical twins, the degree, the Pearson correlation coefficient indicates that somewhere between 0.76 to 0.86 of a correlation from just being an identical twin, but that 10-point difference from environment. This is indicating that much more of your characteristics, your personality, your aptitudes, and so forth are actually driven by genes rather than the environment. And this is actually very backwards compared to what was originally theorized to be true in the early 20th century. The more common story that still floats around but is really old and outdated now is that your parents mold your personality and your aptitude as you grow up. And that turns out not to be true. At least by approximately the year 2000, graphs like this, tables like this, have been put together to show that most of our aptitudes and abilities and personality characteristics actually are derived by genes, and to a lesser extent the environment. And the numbers that you see on the screen here are statistical averages across all of the various types of things that have been measured so far. So this is a broad-based statistical estimate based on personality characteristics, aptitudes, or any other type of characteristic that has been judged since about 1980. So when you take a look at this, identical twins, clearly the most similar of all groups. Fraternal twins drop down. So you have the same parents, but they are simply 2 eggs and 2 sperm that are around prenatally at the same time. And then siblings having the same degree of genetic similarities, fraternal twins, but a different prenatal environment. Which, now, it's the same mom, yeah, but a year later, 2 years later. And that actually does influence the degree of similarity between the individuals. Fraternal twins having the prenatal environment at the same time are always more similar to each other from a statistical standpoint than are siblings that have the same degree of genetic similarity, but they had a different prenatal environment, one that occurred a year apart from each other. And then when you get to adoptees, what you tend to see is that the obviously the genetic similarity between adoptive parents and the adoptive children is of course 0 because they are genetically unrelated, but there's not a great degree of influence of the environment in this case, because it appears that so much more of your characteristics are driven by genes rather than the environment. The degree to which you see similarity between adoptive parents and their adoptive children tends to be very close to 0. And that concludes our lecture on the sociology and social psychology chapter.